My name is Grace Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, people have described me as steady, reliable, the calm one. I work in financial compliance, which means I spend my days looking for inconsistencies that other people overlook. I analyze patterns, study reports, and trace details most people would call insignificant. It's quiet work, invisible work, the kind that only matters when something goes wrong. And that, I suppose, has always been my role. If you met me at a dinner party, you might assume I'm reserved, maybe even passive. I don't dominate conversations. I don't interrupt. I don't perform. I observe. Growing up, I was the easy daughter, the one who didn't cause trouble, the one who didn't ask too many questions. While other children demanded attention, I learned early that being useful earned approval faster than being emotional. So I became helpful, adaptable, efficient. My parents would often say how proud they were of our family. We've always been solid, my mother liked to tell people. No drama. From the outside, we were the picture of stability. Holiday cards with coordinated outfits. Anniversary dinners are posted with warm captions. A home that looked carefully curated, not just decorated, but arranged. For years, I believed in that image too, until the moment I discovered my parents' marriage was nothing more than a perfectly staged act, not a loud, explosive betrayal, not a scandal that shattered dishes and slammed doors. No, what I found was quieter than that. Behind the image of a happy family, I uncovered a carefully maintained illusion, one that had been operating for decades with precision. And the most unsettling part wasn't the lie itself. It was realizing how long I had participated in protecting it without knowing. This story isn't about revenge. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match across a dining table. It's about recognition, about what happens when you stop accepting the version of reality handed to you and begin documenting the truth for yourself. It's about silence, the kind that looks like weakness until it becomes strategy. And it's about what changes inside you when you understand that love built on performance eventually collapses under its own choreography. If you've ever sensed something was wrong, long before you had proof, if you've ever felt like the stable one in a family that only stayed stable because you absorbed the cracks, then maybe you'll understand what this discovery did to me. Have you ever looked back at your childhood and wondered which parts were real and which parts were rehearsed? In my family, I was the quiet equilibrium, not the favorite, not the problem, not the fragile one. I was the stabilizer. My father used to introduce me as our sensible one. My mother preferred low maintenance. They said it with pride, as though they had engineered something impressive. And in a way, they had. By the time I was 8, I understood that emotions complicated things. Tears delayed dinner. Anger disrupted the atmosphere. Questions lingered longer than anyone wanted them to. So I learned to read the room before speaking. I learned that timing mattered more than truth. At school, teachers described me as mature beyond my years. I completed assignments early. I mediated small conflicts between classmates. I didn't demand attention. At home, that translated into usefulness. If my mother was overwhelmed hosting guests, I refilled glasses before she asked. If my father grew quiet after work, I kept conversation light. I instinctively adjusted myself to maintain harmony. And harmony was everything in our house. We didn't argue loudly. We didn't criticize publicly. We didn't contradict each other in front of others. We presented alignment. Looking back, I realize I mistook smoothness for safety. People admired my parents. They seemed balanced. My father is steady and successful. My mother is polished and gracious. They held hands at events. They finished each other's sentences. They laughed in sync. If there were fractures, they were microscopic, invisible to guests. But children notice patterns adults assume they won't. I noticed how my mother's smile would tighten a fraction too long after certain jokes. I noticed how my father's compliments sometimes sounded scripted, as if he'd rehearsed tone without emotion. I noticed how conversation shifted when I entered the room. Still, I told myself this was normal. Every family had dynamics that outsiders didn't see, and I had no reason to suspect anything deeper, because nothing was explosive. There were no slammed doors, no visible betrayals, no whispered phone calls at midnight. There was just perfection. Curated perfection. In high school, when friends confided in me about their parents' divorces or affairs, I would listen quietly, offering careful empathy. I felt almost guilty for how stable my life appeared in comparison. Your family's so lucky, one friend once told me. You guys are like a movie. I remember smiling, because even then something about that comment felt off. Movies have scripts, and scripts are written to control perception. But I didn't have language for that discomfort yet. I only knew my role. Be composed. Be dependable. Don't complicate things. If something felt slightly misaligned, I filed it away internally, as I did at work years later. That's something no one ever noticed about me. While they saw compliance, I was collecting data, not consciously at first. It was more instinct than intention. I remembered dates, tones, subtle changes in routine, who avoided whose gaze during which conversations, who overcompensated in public. But I never confronted anyone, because confronting implied conflict, and conflict threatened the one thing I believed my presence guaranteed: stability. So I stayed invisible in the way people praise, not unseen, just non-disruptive. I built my identity around being the one who required the least emotional maintenance. And when you are labeled easy long enough, you begin to believe that asking hard questions would be selfish. So I didn't ask. I adjusted. I participated in the image. I smiled in the family photos. I stood between them during the anniversary toasts. I reassured distant relatives that everything was good. Because as long as the image held, I told myself it meant the foundation was solid. I had no idea that sometimes the most carefully constructed images exist precisely because the foundation is not. The first crack wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It came with a laugh. I was 19, home from my first semester of college. I had just declared my major in finance, not because anyone pressured me into it, but because I liked structure. Systems made sense to me. Numbers didn't pretend to be something they weren't. We were at a small dinner party my parents were hosting. 4 couples, polished wine glasses, low instrumental music humming in the background. My mother had arranged everything meticulously, as she always did. The table runner was perfectly centered. The candles are evenly spaced. Midway through dinner, one of their friends asked about my studies. Before I could answer, my father smiled and said, "Grace, Oh, she'll probably end up running the whole place one day. She's got my brain. Everyone laughed lightly. I smiled. Then he added, still amused, and thankfully not her mother's sensitivity. That would make compliance impossible. The room chuckled again. It sounded harmless, playful, even affectionate. But I watched my mother. Her smile held, just barely. The corners didn't drop, but they froze. Her fork paused a second too long above her plate before she resumed eating. No one else noticed. Why would they? It was a small comment. A common kind of marital teasing people mistake for intimacy. I felt something shift inside me, though I couldn't yet name it. Later that night, as I helped my mother clear the dishes, I said gently, "Dad was just joking." She rinsed a plate, not looking at me. Of course he was. Her tone was smooth, too smooth. I remember standing there, holding a stack of glasses, sensing that I had stepped into something invisible. That was the first small cut. Not because of what he said, but because of how quickly it was erased. Over the next few days, I began replaying moments from earlier years. Subtle jokes, slight dismissals, compliments that carried comparison. They were always small enough to ignore, and they were always followed by public affection. A hand on her back at church, a kiss on her cheek at family gatherings, anniversary posts online that read like carefully edited scripts. The performance of unity was so polished that even I had accepted it without question. But once you notice one inconsistency, your mind starts scanning for others. I didn't confront anyone. That wasn't my nature. Instead, I observed. I noticed how my father often answered questions directed at my mother, how she deferred when guests were present but grew quieter afterward, how certain topics never surfaced at dinner. Finances, long-term plans, emotional needs. It wasn't hostility, it was choreography. Each of them knew their lines. And I realized something unsettling. I did too. At the next family gathering, when an aunt praised their marriage as a model for all of us, I automatically nodded. I reinforced the narrative. I participated. And that awareness stung more than the original joke. Because if there was something fractured beneath the surface, then I wasn't just witnessing it. I was helping maintain it. The first cut isn't supposed to hurt much. That's how you overlook it. It's small, plausibly accidental, easy to rationalize, but small cuts, repeated quietly over time, leave marks you can't always see, only feel. And that night, lying in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, I once thought it was the safest place in the world. I felt something I had never felt before in that house. Not fear, not anger, just doubt. And doubt, once introduced, doesn't leave politely. It lingers. It waits. It watches. Doubt didn't explode. It settled, like fine dust. You only notice it when sunlight hits it at the right angle. After that dinner, I returned to college and tried to focus on my life. Internships, exams, friendships. But every time I came home, I saw more. Not new behavior, just clearer behavior. That's the unsettling part about normalization. Nothing changes. You do. During my junior year, I visited for Thanksgiving. My parents were in the kitchen preparing dinner together, moving around each other with familiar efficiency. From a distance, they looked synchronized, but up close, the synchronization felt mechanical. My mother asked, "Should we use the larger serving dish?" My father didn't look up from carving. "No, that's unnecessary." She paused. "I just thought—" "It's fine," he interrupted, tone still mild. "Trust me." She nodded. Conversation over. It wasn't rude in the obvious sense. No sharp edges, no hostility. just dismissal wrapped in calm, and she absorbed it so naturally that it felt rehearsed. Later that evening, relatives gathered around the dining table, praising how well my parents worked as a team. My father made a toast about partnership and commitment. My mother smiled at the right beats. They clinked glasses. The image held, and I heard myself say when someone asked, "What's their secret?" They just understand each other. I don't know why I said that. Maybe because admitting uncertainty would have meant admitting instability. And instability threatened the version of home I had built my identity around. So I rationalized, maybe this is just how long marriages function. Maybe compromise looks uneven from the outside. Maybe I'm overanalyzing. After all, I studied compliance. I was trained to detect discrepancies. Perhaps I was projecting my professional habits onto my personal life, but the patterns persisted. Conversations redirected, opinions overridden, emotions minimized in subtle ways that would never survive courtroom scrutiny, but accumulated privately like compound interest. I began noticing something else too. Whenever tension flickered, even lightly, my instinct was to intervene. Not verbally, energetically. If my father grew quiet, I filled the space with neutral updates about work. If my mother seemed withdrawn, I complimented dinner or asked about her garden. I buffered, and they let me. It became clear that my role wasn't accidental. I was the regulator, the presence that kept conversations smooth, the one who translated between them without either having to acknowledge friction. And because I did it without complaint, it was invisible. One evening, after a minor disagreement about travel plans, my mother came into my room. She sat at the edge of my bed the way she used to when I was a child. "He means well," she said quietly. I hadn't asked. "I know," I replied. And in that exchange, something crystallized. She wasn't defending him to me. She was defending the narrative to herself, and I was complicit by agreeing. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through repetition, through the steady lowering of standards until imbalance feels ordinary, through the quiet agreement to keep the peace instead of examining its cost. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was disappointed, not in them as individuals, but in the structure, in the realization that the stability I admired might be less about mutual strength and more about silent endurance. And the most uncomfortable thought began forming at the edge of my awareness. If their marriage depended on choreography, then what would happen if someone stopped following the script? At that point, I still believed my role was protection. Protect the image, protect the harmony, protect them from the embarrassment of imperfection. What I hadn't yet understood was that protecting an illusion requires sacrificing something real. And eventually, the person you sacrifice is yourself. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in glances, in the way conversations rearranged themselves when I entered the room. By my late 20s, I was no longer just their daughter. I was an adult with a career, my own apartment, my own carefully structured life. But when I stepped back into that house, something subtle shifted. I became younger. Not in age, in function. The stabilizer returned. One Sunday afternoon, I sat at the kitchen island while my parents discussed refinancing the house. I hadn't been invited into the conversation, but my father looked toward me midway through and said, "Grace is good with numbers. She'll tell us if this makes sense." It sounded like praise, but it wasn't a partnership. It was an arbitration. They weren't asking for my insight as equals. They were outsourcing tension. I reviewed the paperwork quietly, pointed out a few clauses, suggested questions to ask the bank. They both nodded, grateful, relieved, and just like that, the air softened. Later, my mother squeezed my shoulder and said, "We don't know what we'd do without you." At first, that warmed me. But on the drive home, the words replayed differently. "We don't know what we'd do without you." Not because I was loved, because I was useful. That's when I began to understand the role I had been assigned. I wasn't just the quiet daughter. I was the emotional infrastructure, the bridge, the buffer, the translator. Whenever discomfort threatened the image, I absorbed it. If my father's tone sharpened, I rephrased it into something gentler. If my mother withdrew, I filled the silence so it didn't become noticeable. I made their marriage look smoother than it was. And I did it so seamlessly that even I believed it was natural. But roles become dangerous when they're never questioned. Over time, I noticed something else. My presence prevented them from addressing each other directly. If a disagreement arose during my visits, it rarely escalated because I stepped in, not dramatically, just enough to redirect, and they allowed it. Not consciously, perhaps, but consistently. I started wondering, what happens when I'm not here? Do they sit in silence? Do they avoid certain topics entirely? Or do they simply wait for the next public appearance, where harmony can be performed again? One evening, after a particularly tense discussion about future retirement plans, my father said lightly, "Grace always keeps us grounded." It was meant as a compliment, but I heard something else. Grace keeps us from confronting what we don't want to confront. That was the moment the role became visible to me. Reliable, useful, invisible. Invisible not in presence, but in needs. No one asked how it felt to mediate. No one wondered whether I wanted to be neutral ground, because I had never expressed resistance. I had been so committed to stability that I forgot stability requires mutual effort, not a silent sacrifice from the least disruptive person in the room. The role had shaped me too. In my own relationships, I found myself smoothing tension before it surfaced, choosing partners who appreciated my calm but rarely challenged themselves to grow emotionally. I wasn't just observing a pattern, I was replicating it. And that realization unsettled me more than anything I'd seen in my parents, because it meant the illusion wasn't contained to them. It was generational, passed down not through instructions, but through example. And for the first time, a quiet question surfaced inside me. What if the most loyal thing I could do was stop playing the role they assigned me? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It happened in silence. It was a Tuesday evening in early October. I had come over after work because my mother had asked, says if I could look over something quickly. That was usually code for financial paperwork, insurance forms, investment summaries, things my father didn't have the patience to explain twice. When I arrived, the house was unusually quiet. No music, no television murmuring in the background. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the hallway clock. My father was in his study. The door was closed. My mother sat at the dining table with a folder open in front of her, but she wasn't reading it. She was staring at the same page, unmoving. I pulled out the chair across from her. "What do you need help with?" She blinked, as if remembering I was there. Then she turned the folder toward me. It wasn't insurance paperwork. It was a draft of a property agreement, not a divorce filing, not even a legal separation, but a post-nuptial adjustment outlining asset protections. In the event of future restructuring, the language was clinical, controlled, almost sterile. I felt my heartbeat steady instead of spiking, That's how I knew something significant was happening. When shock makes you calmer instead of louder. Dad asked for this? I asked gently. She hesitated. It's just precautionary. Precautionary, the word echoed. Precaution implies risk. Risk implies instability. I read the document carefully. There were clauses about property distribution, about business interests, and about financial insulation. It was written to preserve the image, not dissolve it. No public fallout, no visible fracture, just structural protection beneath the surface. Is this what you want? I asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said something that shifted everything. He thinks it's wise to prepare quietly. Prepare for what? That was the question neither of us voiced. In that moment, the illusion didn't shatter. It clarified. This wasn't a strong marriage, occasionally strained by life. This was a carefully managed partnership built on risk mitigation. And suddenly, years of subtle dismissals, choreographed affection, and controlled narratives aligned into something coherent. They weren't in harmony, they were in maintenance mode, maintaining image, maintaining assets, maintaining social perception. And I had been part of that maintenance team. I looked at my mother across the table, really looked at her, not as the polished hostess, not as the woman who absorbed small jokes with practiced grace, but as someone who had adapted so thoroughly to the script that she no longer distinguished performance from preference. Are you okay? I asked quietly. She gave the same answer she had given my entire life. Of course. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not betrayal. Clarity. If they were preparing quietly for instability, then the stability I had defended didn't exist. It was branding. And branding requires consistency, which explained why the conflict was smoothed so quickly. Why were they protected? Why had been positioned as an emotional mediator? Because real conversations threatened the brand. I closed the folder gently. I'll review the clauses and make notes, I said. My tone remained steady, but internally something fundamental had changed. For the first time, I understood that silence could serve two different purposes. It could protect illusion, or it could protect the truth. And I realized I had been using mine for the wrong one. That night, driving home under the soft wash of streetlights, I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend. I didn't spiral. I simply made a quiet decision. I would stop stabilizing what was never stable. I would stop smoothing what needed to be examined, not with confrontation, not with drama, but with distance. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else, but inside me the role had ended, and something new, quieter, sharper, had begun. After that night, I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront my father about the agreement. I didn't press my mother for confessions she wasn't ready to make. I didn't accuse them of staging their marriage. I simply changed my participation. Silence for most of my life had been reflex. Now it has become deliberate. The next time I visited, a familiar pattern began unfolding. My father made a passing comment about my mother being overly cautious about a minor purchase. Normally, I would have softened it, redirected, smiled to signal harmlessness. This time, I said nothing, not coldly, not dramatically, just nothing. The air shifted, barely perceptible, but real. My mother glanced at me, almost instinctively, as if waiting for reinforcement. I held her gaze gently, but I didn't intervene. The conversation stumbled for half a second before my father continued speaking, filling the gap himself. It was small, but it was the first time I allowed a moment to exist without managing it. Over the next few weeks, I began practicing restraint in subtle ways. When financial topics arose, I answered direct questions and nothing more. When tension flickered, I didn't smooth it. When they tried to loop me into decisions as a mediator, I responded with neutrality instead of resolution. You two should discuss what feels best, I would say calmly. They mistook it for busyness at first, or independence. That's good, my father said once. You don't need to be involved in everything. He meant it as permission. He didn't realize I was accepting it as liberation. Silence, when it's no longer automatic, reveals things. Without my buffering, I began noticing longer pauses between them. Conversations that drifted instead of being resolved. Topics are subtly avoided rather than redirected. Nothing explosive, just the absence of my invisible labor. And in that absence, the choreography faltered. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I was simply declining to uphold a structure that wasn't mine to maintain. At first, it felt uncomfortable, almost disloyal. Years of conditioning told me that peace depended on my involvement, that stepping back was selfish. But another part of me, the part trained in compliance and patterns, understood something critical. If a system collapses when one stabilizing variable is removed, then the system was never structurally sound. It was dependent. And dependency, masquerading as strength, is fragile. One evening, my mother called me after what she described as a miscommunication with my father. She began recounting the situation in careful detail, as she often did, waiting for me to validate her perspective. In the past, I would have reassured her, translated his tone, softened his stance. This time, I listened fully. Then I asked gently, "Have you told him that directly?" There was a pause. "Well, no, it didn't seem necessary." "Maybe it is," I replied quietly. I wasn't advising rebellion. I was declining translation. After we hung up, I sat on my couch with my black leather notebook open in front of me. For years, I had used it to track financial details, deadlines, and projections. That night, I began documenting something different. Patterns, conversations, shifts in tone, dates of legal discussions. Not to expose, to understand. Silence, when chosen, becomes observation. Observation becomes knowledge. And knowledge, eventually, becomes leverage. Not over others, but over your own illusions. They still saw me as steady, as reliable. They didn't notice that my steadiness no longer served their image. It served my clarity. And clarity doesn't raise its voice. It waits. When you stop reacting, people assume nothing is happening. That was their first miscalculation. My silence wasn't emptiness, it was preparation. I didn't wake up one morning determined to dismantle my parents' illusion. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even a rebellion. It was an audit. At work, when we conduct compliance reviews, we don't accuse. We observe. We gather documents. We trace patterns across time. We identify risk exposure. Quietly, I applied the same discipline at home, not by snooping, not by violating privacy, but by paying attention to what had always been visible, just previously filtered through loyalty. I began keeping structured notes in my black leather notebook. Dates of legal consultations, mentions of asset protection, subtle language shifts from our future to individual security. Patterns of scheduling. Who traveled alone? Who avoided which events? I wasn't looking for scandal. I was mapping reality. And what emerged wasn't dramatic. It was strategic. Their marriage wasn't collapsing. It was compartmentalized. Public image remained intact. Carefully curated social media posts, anniversary dinners photographed at flattering angles, joint appearances at charity events. Privately, financial structures were being separated with precision. Two parallel systems operating under one brand. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me aware. Because if they were protecting themselves quietly, then I needed to understand how that protection affected me. I requested a copy of certain estate planning documents under the pretense of wanting to be organized for the future. That part wasn't even false. My father was pleased. "You've always been responsible," he said. He handed over summaries without hesitation. He never considered that responsibility includes verification. I reviewed beneficiary structures, property ownership formats, trust clauses, contingency language. What I discovered wasn't malicious, but it was telling. Assets that had once been jointly held were being reassigned. Risk was being minimized individually. Protection, but not partnership. And nowhere in those adjustments was there acknowledgement of emotional restructuring, just financial insulation. That's when I understood the depth of the illusion. It wasn't just for friends or extended family. It was for themselves. As long as the external image held, neither of them had to confront the emotional vacancy underneath. And I had been the emotional adhesive. But here's what they never noticed. The more I withdrew from stabilizing them, the more I stabilized myself. I met with a financial advisor independently. I reviewed my own savings, investments, and long-term security without assuming inheritance or shared family assets. I adjusted my expectations downward, not out of bitterness, out of realism. If their partnership was conditional and strategically compartmentalized, then I needed to detach my sense of future from their performance of unity. This wasn't about money. It was about psychological independence. For years, some part of me had felt anchored to the idea that their stability guaranteed mine. Now I saw clearly. My stability had always been self-generated. Another thing they didn't notice? I stopped reinforcing their narrative socially. When acquaintances praised their marriage, I smiled politely. But I no longer elaborated. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't expose anything. I simply stopped marketing the brand. And without my subtle endorsements, the image began to feel less convincing, though no one could articulate why. The most powerful shift wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped measuring love by smoothness. I stopped admiring harmony that required silence. I stopped equating endurance with strength. Instead, I began asking different questions. Is this mutual? Is this transparent? Is this chosen or maintained out of fear of disruption? Preparation isn't loud. It's cumulative. And while they continued adjusting legal structures quietly, I was adjusting emotional ones. They were protecting assets. I was protecting truth. And truth, once documented, changes how you move, even if no one else sees it yet. Part 8. The private reveal. Approximately 750 words. The truth didn't arrive in a dramatic confession. It revealed itself the way most things in my life do, through documentation. A month after I began reviewing estate summaries, my father casually mentioned he had a meeting with his attorney to finalize a few updates. His tone was relaxed, administrative, but something in the phrasing stood out. Finalize. That word implies completion. Later that week, I received an email, accidentally forwarded to me as part of a longer thread about insurance. It included a revised trust structure attachment. My name was listed, but not in the way I expected. not as shared beneficiary of unified family holdings, as a contingent recipient of two individually shielded entities, separate, strategically partitioned. I didn't react immediately. I printed the document, sat at my dining table, and read every clause twice. The language was careful, neutral, designed to prevent dispute. But it confirmed what I had already sensed. They weren't building a shared future. They were preparing for individual exits, while preserving the optics of togetherness. Behind the image of a happy family, I uncovered a carefully maintained illusion. Not infidelity, not cruelty, not even hatred, just an agreement, unspoken, sustained, that appearance was more valuable than authenticity. And here was the part that shifted everything. They both knew. This wasn't one person secretly protecting themselves. It was mutual. A silent understanding that whatever their marriage had once been, it was now a structure to be managed, not a relationship to be repaired. And I had been standing in the center of it, believing I was protecting something real. That night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront my mother with the document. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. The illusion is collaborative. That realization removed anger from the equation. If this had been betrayal, one villain, one victim, it would have been easier, cleaner. But this was choreography. Two adults choosing stability of image over discomfort of truth. And suddenly, I understood something about myself that startled me. I wasn't grieving their marriage. I was grieving the story I had built around it. The story that stability meant safety, that harmony meant love, that endurance meant depth. The private reveal wasn't about finances. It was about clarity. For years, I had felt a subtle obligation to uphold the model family identity, to live up to it, to replicate it in my own relationships. Now I felt released. If the model was constructed, then I didn't have to inherit it. The leverage I discovered wasn't a secret that could destroy them. It was knowledge that could free me. Because once you see that a system survives on performance, you realize you don't owe it applause. I began making decisions quietly. I removed assumptions about future shared assets from my long-term planning. I updated my own legal documents. I reduced emotional dependency on family validation. And something unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not triumphant, not vindicated, just clear. When I visited the house again, nothing looked different. My parents still moved around each other with polite coordination. They still hosted dinners, still posted smiling photos. But I no longer watched with confusion. I watched with understanding. They weren't lying maliciously. They were surviving the only way they knew how, by maintaining structure. The difference now was that I wasn't part of the scaffolding, and that private awareness changed the way I stood in rooms. I wasn't there to stabilize. I wasn't there to interpret. I wasn't there to absorb. I was there as myself. For the first time, their illusion didn't feel like something I needed to expose. It felt like something I simply needed to step outside of. And stepping outside is irreversible. Because once you've seen the mechanics behind the stage set, you can never mistake it for a real house again. Clarity is quiet, but decisions are not. They echo internally, long before they are visible externally. After the private reveal, I understood something essential. I had options. I could confront them, lay the documents on the table and force acknowledgement. I could expose the illusion socially, subtly correcting every person who praised their marriage. I could withdraw entirely, reduce visits, distance myself emotionally, let the structure collapse without my presence. Each option carried consequence, and none of them felt aligned with who I was becoming, because this was never about punishment. It was about alignment. The irreversible choice wasn't confrontation. It was detachment, not physical absence, psychological independence. For years, my identity had been interwoven with their narrative. I was the daughter of the stable couple, the product of a solid foundation, the living proof that harmony produced strength. But if that harmony was curated, if stability was a managed brand, then I needed to rebuild my identity without leaning on it. That was the real decision point. I stopped introducing my upbringing as evidence of emotional security. I stopped citing my parents' marriage as a model in conversations about relationships. I stopped absorbing pride that wasn't fully honest. It seems subtle, but identity shifts are seismic when they happen internally. I remember sitting in my apartment one Sunday morning, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors, and asking myself a question I had avoided for years. If my parents divorced tomorrow, publicly, would it dismantle who I believe I am? The answer startled me. No, and that no felt like freedom. The irreversible choice was this: I would no longer anchor my sense of safety to their performance of unity. I would build stability that did not depend on image. To do that, I had to accept something quietly difficult. I might never get a dramatic confession. They might never sit me down and say, "We've been pretending," and I didn't need them to. Because closure doesn't require admission when you've already seen the evidence. The following week, my father mentioned an upcoming anniversary dinner. 40 years, he said proudly. That's rare these days. I looked at him calmly and replied, longevity and closeness aren't always the same thing. He paused, just briefly, not offended, just surprised. It was the first time I had spoken without reinforcing the brand, not confrontational, not accusatory, just true. That was the irreversible step. Once you introduce truth into a carefully curated system, even gently, the choreography shifts. You can't return to unconscious participation. I didn't argue further. I didn't elaborate. But from that moment forward, I stopped being the silent guarantor of their image. And something subtle changed in them too. They began addressing each other directly, more often when I was present. They hesitated before making dismissive jokes. They looked at me, not for mediation, but for reaction. They sensed the difference. They just didn't name it. And neither did I, because the most powerful decisions don't require announcement. They require consistency. I had chosen my position, not inside the illusion, not attacking it, but standing just outside it, steady, observant, unentangled. And once you step outside the script, you don't get cast in the same role again. Part 10. Moving in silence. Approximately 650 words. After the decision was made internally, my movements became precise, not reactive, strategic. When you've spent your life stabilizing others, you learn how to operate without drawing attention. I applied that same discipline to myself. First, I separated expectation from reality. I revised my long-term financial projections as if there would be no shared family assets passed down jointly, no assumed property continuity, no emotional inheritance of the house that always felt like home. I didn't do this out of resentment. I did it out of clarity. Next, I scheduled a meeting with my own estate planner. I updated beneficiary designations, created contingencies, established structures that reflected independence, not implied unity. If my parents were preparing quietly for restructuring, I would prepare for autonomy. No one noticed. Why would they? Adults organizing their finances isn't suspicious. It's responsible, and responsibility had always been my brand. The difference was intention. I also began adjusting something less tangible, my availability. When my mother called to process minor tensions, I listened, but I stopped offering solutions that restored comfort without resolution. When my father sought validation about financial decisions that subtly insulated him, I asked neutral questions instead of affirming efficiency. You'll have to decide what feels aligned, I would say. Aligned. It was a word that subtly redirected accountability. At family gatherings, I became observant rather than adhesive. If a joke landed awkwardly, I let the silence breathe. If a disagreement hovered beneath the surface, I didn't smooth it with humor. Without my invisible labor, they had to manage their own narrative in real time. And that required effort. I could see it. In the longer pauses, in the slightly less polished exchanges. The illusion didn't shatter, but it required maintenance. And for the first time, that maintenance didn't include me. One evening, my father mentioned revising certain documents again. Just minor adjustments, he said casually. I nodded. That makes sense. No curiosity, no involvement. He looked at me for a moment, perhaps expecting a deeper dive, but I offered none. That was new. I wasn't disengaged emotionally. I was disentangled structurally. And disentanglement is invisible at first. You don't announce it. You simply stop reinforcing connections that no longer serve truth. Privately, I began investing more intentionally in my own life, not as a reaction to their illusion, but as a response to my clarity. I strengthened friendships that valued transparency. I dated differently, asking harder questions earlier. I stopped admiring smooth dynamics and started respecting honest ones. There was a quiet power in this shift, not dominance over them, dominance over my own patterns. They sensed something had changed. I could feel it in the way conversations sometimes recalibrated when I entered the room, but they couldn't identify it. Because I hadn't accused, I hadn't exposed, I hadn't withdrawn dramatically. I had simply moved in silence. Strategic silence isn't passive, it's controlled energy. And the longer I maintained it, the clearer one truth became. When you stop supporting an illusion, you don't have to destroy it. It begins adjusting itself. And adjustment always comes with consequences. They just hadn't surfaced yet. Part 11. The consequences begin. Approximately 650 words. Consequences don't always arrive as explosions. Sometimes they arrive as absence. A few months after I stepped back from my role, the atmosphere in my parents' home felt heavier. Not hostile, not broken, just unbuffered. At a small dinner gathering, I watched them navigate conversation without my subtle interventions. When my father made a dismissive comment about my mother's travel preferences, there was no gentle redirection from me. The silence that followed stretched half a second longer than usual. Guests noticed, not consciously, but in the way people shift in their seats when something feels slightly misaligned. My mother responded directly instead of deferring. I don't think it's unnecessary, she said calmly. It matters to me. The room held still for a beat. My father nodded. All right. It was minor, civil, but new. Without me smoothing edges, they had to engage each other more directly. And direct engagement is uncomfortable when you've relied on choreography. Over time, the consequences became more visible, though still subtle. They argued more often in my presence, not loudly, but openly. Not cruelly, but honestly. The first time it happened, my instinct was immediate. Stabilize, redirect. I felt it in my chest, that old reflex rising like muscle memory. And I let it pass. I stayed seated, calm, observant. They resolved it themselves. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished, but it was real. And real has texture that performance doesn't. Another consequence surfaced socially. When relatives praised their effortless partnership, I no longer reinforced the narrative. I smiled politely and changed topics. Without my enthusiastic validation, the praise felt slightly less convincing. Again, nothing dramatic, just subtle recalibration. One evening, my mother called me, her voice more unsettled than usual. "We've been talking more," she said carefully. I didn't respond immediately. "That's good," I said gently. "It's not always comfortable." "I imagine it wouldn't be." There was a pause. Then she asked something unexpected. "Did we put too much on you?" The question hung between us. I could have reassured her, could have protected her from the discomfort of self-examination. Instead, I chose honesty without accusation. "I stepped into what was available," I said quietly. "I just don't think it was mine to carry." She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply exhaled. The consequences weren't punitive. They were corrective. When you remove yourself from a role that was never assigned consciously, but always relied upon, the system adjusts, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes painfully, but authentically. My father began including my mother more explicitly in decisions when I was present. He paused before answering for her. He asked her opinion instead of assuming it. Was it transformation? No, but it was awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable at first. For me, the consequence was internal too. I no longer felt responsible for their emotional temperature. The house didn't feel lighter, but I did. There's a quiet shift that happens when you realize peace doesn't require your participation to exist. It either stands on its own or it doesn't. And watching them navigate that distinction without me was both sobering and liberating. The illusion wasn't collapsing, it was evolving. And evolution, even when quiet, changes everything. Part 12. Too late to fix it. Approximately 650 words. Awareness changes the atmosphere of a room. Once something has been seen, truly seen, it can't return to its original shape. Over the next year, my parents' marriage didn't implode. It recalibrated. They began having more visible disagreements. Still controlled, still dignified, but no longer entirely hidden behind choreography. And with that shift came something neither of them had anticipated. Regret, not about each other necessarily, about time. One evening, I arrived for dinner and found them sitting in the living room, not speaking. The television was on, muted. My mother was holding a photo album, old anniversary pictures. In each image, they looked radiant, coordinated, smiling into cameras with practiced ease. My father noticed me first. "We were just reminiscing," he said lightly, but his tone lacked conviction. My mother closed the album slowly. "We spent so much energy making it look right," she said, almost to herself. That sentence lingered in the air longer than any argument ever had. For decades, they had optimized perception, optimized reputation, optimized stability. But optimization doesn't guarantee intimacy. And now that the choreography had softened, they were confronting something quieter and heavier. They didn't know each other without the performance. It wasn't dramatic panic. It was subtle disorientation. They had built systems around conflict avoidance, financial safeguards, social reinforcement, emotional delegation. To me, Now, without the delegation, they had to face the raw architecture of their marriage. And architecture built around avoidance doesn't easily transform into vulnerability. My father began asking reflective questions in passing. "Do you think people can change after 40 years?" he asked one night while washing dishes. "Yes," I said calmly, "but only if they want to see what needs changing." He nodded slowly. My mother grew more direct too. She expressed preferences more openly. She challenged him occasionally. But beneath those changes, there was something else. Grief. Not grief over betrayal. Grief over emotional years that had been managed rather than lived. And here's the part that mattered most. It was too late to return to unconscious performance. They could adjust forward, but they couldn't undo decades of choreography. That realization was painful for them. I could see it in the way conversations sometimes trailed off into silence. Not tense silence, but reflective silence. They were confronting a question they had postponed for years. Did we choose image over intimacy? And if so, why? For me, there was no triumph in this moment. No sense of vindication, just clarity. I didn't feel superior. I felt separate. I had already detached my identity from their narrative. Their awakening, partial and imperfect, didn't destabilize me. But it did shift our dynamic permanently. One night, my mother said something that confirmed everything. "We thought keeping everything smooth was protecting you," she admitted. I looked at her gently. "Sometimes protection hides the truth," I replied. She didn't argue, because she knew. The illusion had been a shield, but also a barrier. And now, standing in the quieter aftermath of that recognition, they were left with something they had avoided for years. Authenticity. You can't fix decades of performance overnight. You can't rewind and choose vulnerability earlier. You can only face what remains. And facing what remains requires courage they hadn't practiced before. The consequences weren't explosive. They were irreversible. The stage lights had dimmed, and there was no returning to rehearsal. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't planned. There was no dramatic gathering, no documents laid across the dining table. It unfolded on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. We were sitting in the backyard, early autumn light, leaves beginning to thin, the kind of day that feels transitional without announcing why. My father had been unusually reflective lately, my mother quieter but not withdrawn, present in a way I hadn't seen before. At one point, my father looked at me and said, "You've changed." It wasn't accusatory, it was observational. "I think I've just stepped back," I replied. "From us?" My mother asked softly. "From managing things that weren't mine to manage." There it was. Not sharp, just clear. They exchanged a glance. Not defensive, not surprised, just aware. My father leaned back in his chair. "We didn't realize we were asking you to do that." "I know," I said, and I meant it. This wasn't about blame. It was about acknowledgement. My mother folded her hands in her lap. "We thought we were showing you stability." "You showed me discipline," I said calmly. "Commitment, endurance, but not always closeness." Silence settled between us, not tense, reflective. No one raised their voice. No one denied anything. My father exhaled slowly. "It's complicated after this many years." "I'm sure it is," I replied. There was no need to dissect every detail. No need to reference documents or financial restructuring. We all understood what was being discussed, even without naming it directly. The performance, the maintenance, the illusion that longevity equals intimacy. "I'm not angry," I said quietly. "I just needed to stop participating in something that didn't feel real." My mother's eyes softened. "We weren't trying to deceive you." "I know, but you were trying to protect something." "Each other?" my father asked. Your image, I answered gently. He didn't argue. That was the most telling part. For decades, they had protected the appearance of harmony, and now, in this quiet backyard, they were confronting the cost of that protection. No shouting, no dramatic revelations. Just three adults sitting in honest recognition. My father finally said, "We're trying to do it differently now." "I can see that," I replied. And I could. They weren't perfect. They weren't suddenly vulnerable in cinematic ways, but they were less choreographed, less polished, more deliberate. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with clarity. I stood up to leave, hugged them both, and felt something unfamiliar. Not obligation, not responsibility, just connection, imperfect and real. There was no explosion because there didn't need to be. Truth, when delivered calmly, doesn't burn. It settles, and once settled, it doesn't need to be repeated. If you had met me 5 years ago, you would have described me as steady. If you met me now, you might still use that word, but it would mean something different. Back then, steadiness meant containment, absorption, adaptation. Now, steadiness means alignment. The difference is subtle, but everything in my life feels built on it. I no longer measure strength by how well something appears to function. I measure it by how honestly it operates when no one is watching. My parents are still together, but their marriage no longer feels like a polished exhibit. It feels lived in, slightly uneven, occasionally uncomfortable, more human. They still host dinners, still celebrate anniversaries, but the choreography is softer now. There are pauses that aren't rushed, disagreements that aren't erased, preferences voiced without immediate correction. They're not transformed into a cinematic love story. They're simply more transparent. And I no longer feel responsible for protecting what exists between them. The greatest shift, though, happened inside me. I stopped chasing relationships that looked stable on paper. I began asking harder questions early, not to interrogate, but to understand. When I sense avoidance, I don't smooth it. When something feels misaligned, I don't rationalize it. When a dynamic requires me to shrink to preserve harmony, I step back quietly. I've learned that dominance doesn't require volume, it requires boundaries. There's a certain calm that comes from knowing you don't owe performance to anyone. Not your family, not your partner, not even the version of yourself you once tried to protect. I still carry my black leather notebook, but the entries have changed. Less documentation of other people's patterns, more reflection on my own choices. I don't resent my parents. In many ways, I respect them more now, not for their image, but for their willingness to confront what they had avoided, even late, even imperfectly. And I respect myself most of all for stepping outside the illusion without trying to burn it down. There's power in restraint, power in seeing clearly without weaponizing what you see. Power in choosing independence over indignation. I used to believe my role was to stabilize everyone else. Now I understand something far simpler. My responsibility is to live in alignment with what's true, even when the truth is quieter than the story people prefer. The house I grew up in hasn't changed, but I no longer see it as a monument to perfection. I see it as a structure built by two imperfect people, doing their best with the tools they had. And I see myself as someone who chose different tools, not louder, just more honest. For most of my life, I believed stability was the highest form of love. If something lasted, it was strong. If it looked harmonious, it was healthy. If no one complained, it was working. But what I learned slowly, quietly, is that longevity can coexist with distance. Harmony can mask avoidance, and silence can either protect peace or protect fear. The moment I discovered my parents' marriage was nothing more than a perfectly staged act, wasn't a moment of collapse. It was a moment of awakening. Behind the image of a happy family, I uncovered a carefully maintained illusion, not built from cruelty, not sustained by hatred, but constructed from discipline, pride, and the belief that appearance was safer than vulnerability. And here's the truth that changed me. You don't have to destroy an illusion to free yourself from it. You simply have to stop participating. You can love people without endorsing their narrative. You can respect history without inheriting its patterns. You can step outside a script without humiliating the actors. Quiet dominance isn't about exposure, it's about clarity. It's about standing in truth without needing applause for it. My parents are still together, but now what exists between them is less polished and more real. And what exists within me is steadier than anything I borrowed from their image. If you grew up believing your family was perfect, I hope you know this. Perfection isn't proof of health. Sometimes it's proof of rehearsal. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't confrontation, it's detachment with dignity. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm simply no longer confused. And clarity, once earned, becomes a kind of quiet freedom. So I'll leave you with this question, not to judge your story, but to gently examine it. Have you ever mistaken stability for intimacy? And what changed when you finally looked closer?